Some nations collapse so completely that contemporaries assume their story has ended. Yet history shows that political communities can stagger back from famine, foreign conquest, and civil war to build new systems on the ruins of the old. Across centuries and continents, empires and kingdoms have plunged into periods of chaos that looked terminal, only to re-emerge in transformed but recognizably continuous forms. These reversals illustrate how deeply rooted institutions, cultures, and identities can survive even when armies, capitals, and dynasties fall. Number 1 follows ancient Egypt as it fell under foreign domination and then rose into the New Kingdom, one of the most powerful states of the Bronze Age. In the 17th century BCE, the Nile Valley was divided during what historians call the Second Intermediate Period. Northern Egypt was controlled by the Hyksos, a group of rulers of mixed Near Eastern origin who introduced new military technologies such as the horse-drawn chariot, while native Egyptian dynasties clung to power in Thebes in the south. The unity and prestige of the Old and Middle Kingdoms had vanished, royal authority was fractured, and the once centralized state was overshadowed by foreign elites. This crisis mattered because Egypt had been one of the earliest and most stable river civilizations, and its fragmentation signaled a major shift in power across the eastern Mediterranean. Over several decades, Theban rulers fought a grinding war of liberation. Around 1550 BCE, Ahmose I, a southern king, finally expelled the Hyksos from their capital in the delta and reunified the two lands. The immediate result was the restoration of Egyptian control over its own core territory. In the longer term, Egypt did not stop at recovery. It pushed south into Nubia, campaigned into the Levant, and developed into a territorial empire that projected power far beyond the Nile. Monumental temples at places like Karnak and Luxor, expanded bureaucracy, and a professionalized army turned the trauma of foreign rule into the launching point for a new imperial version of the Egyptian state. Number 2 examines how China moved from centuries of civil war and division after the fall of the Han dynasty to a new era of unity under the Sui and Tang dynasties. When the Han Empire collapsed in 220 CE, the vast territory that had once been administered from a single court broke apart into rival kingdoms and shifting coalitions during what is often called the period of division. Northern regions were repeatedly overrun by nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples from the steppe, while southern regimes tried to preserve fragments of Han traditions along the Yangtze River and further south. For nearly 400 years, China lacked a single enduring dynasty, and warfare, population displacement, and local militarization became normal. This prolonged disunity was significant because it interrupted the centralized imperial model that had defined Chinese political life since the Qin and early Han, raising the possibility that the old order might never return. In 581, a general named Yang Jian established the Sui dynasty, gradually conquering rival states and reunifying most of the historical Chinese heartland. The Sui undertook massive infrastructure projects such as the Grand Canal, a man-made waterway linking northern and southern river systems to facilitate grain transport and troop movement, though the strain of these projects contributed to the dynasty's short lifespan. Its successor, the Tang dynasty, consolidated this reunification from 618 onward, building a sophisticated bureaucracy that relied increasingly on civil service examinations testing knowledge of classical texts. In the short term, unity restored long-distance trade, tax collection, and state-sponsored defense. Over the longer term, the Sui-Tang restoration re-established a pattern of centralized imperial rule that would influence East Asia for more than a millennium, turning the memory of fragmentation into a cautionary backdrop for later dynasties. Number 3 turns to the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman state, which seemed fatally wounded after the defeat at Manzikert in 1071, yet experienced a substantial revival under the Comnenian emperors. By the late 11th century, Byzantium had already endured internal coups and external pressure, but the Battle of Manzikert, fought against the Seljuk Turks in eastern Anatolia, marked a dramatic reversal. Large portions of the empire's Anatolian heartland were overrun, tax revenue collapsed, and local military garrisons were shattered. Anatolia, the peninsula that forms most of modern Turkey, had served as the empire's main recruiting ground and agricultural base, so its loss was almost existential. In the following decade, the empire also faced Norman invasions in the Western Balkans and political infighting in Constantinople, its capital. This combination of territorial loss, financial strain, and dynastic instability led many contemporaries to assume that Byzantine power was entering its end stage. In 1081, Alexios I Comnenian took the throne and began a deliberate process of reconstruction. He reorganized the army around new types of landholding soldiers and mercenaries, negotiated with Italian maritime republics such as Venice for naval support, and, crucially, appealed to the Latin West for military aid, an appeal that helped trigger the First Crusade. While the Crusaders pursued their own aims, their passage through imperial territory allowed Alexios to recover some coastal cities and interior fortresses. His successors, John II and Manuel I Comnenian, continued these policies, stabilizing frontiers, increasing tax income, and reasserting Byzantine influence in Greece, western Anatolia, and parts of the eastern Mediterranean. In the immediate sense, the Comnenian restoration turned an apparently terminal crisis into roughly a century of renewed strength. Over the longer term, the empire could not escape later disasters, including the sack of Constantinople in 1204, but the Comnenoi demonstrated that even an empire that seemed mortally wounded on multiple fronts could leverage diplomacy, military reform, and opportunistic alliances to regain substantial ground. Number 4 considers how the Kingdom of France emerged from devastation during the 100 Years' War to become a stronger and more centralized state. Beginning in 1337, a prolonged conflict with the kings of England over dynastic claims and territorial control ravaged much of the French countryside. English victories such as the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, combined with internal French civil conflicts between factions aligned with rival noble houses, left the Valois monarchy fragmented and discredited. By the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, a significant part of the French elite accepted the English king as heir to the French throne, and large swaths of northern France were under English occupation or influence. This situation represented not just a temporary setback, but a profound crisis of legitimacy and territorial integrity for the French crown. In the 1420s and 1430s, a series of events began to reverse this collapse, including the campaigns associated with Joan of Arc, a young peasant woman who claimed divine guidance and helped lift the siege of Orleans, boosting morale and facilitating the coronation of Charles VII at Reims. While Joan herself was captured and executed, the momentum shifted. Charles VII and his advisors reformed the army, creating more permanent companies of royal troops instead of relying solely on feudal levies, and reorganized taxation, especially through the taille, a direct land tax that funded standing forces. By 1453, French forces had expelled the English from all major holdings in continental France except Calais. The immediate consequence of this recovery was the restoration of French territorial unity and the end of the era when English kings plausibly claimed the French crown. Over the following decades, especially under Louis XI, the monarchy weakened the independence of powerful regional nobles, built a more uniform administration, and laid the groundwork for the highly centralized state that would dominate Western Europe in later centuries. The kingdom that had teetered on the edge of partition and foreign control thus emerged from its crisis with a more robust set of institutions than before the war. Number 5 traces the Iberian Christian kingdom's long climb from defeat and near extinction after the early 8th century Muslim conquest to the creation of a unified Spanish monarchy that projected power across the oceans. In 711, an army of Muslim forces from North Africa, often labeled collectively as Arabs and Berbers and acting under the wider Umayyad Caliphate, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and defeated the Visigothic king at the Battle of Guadalete. Within a few years, most of the Iberian Peninsula, which encompasses modern Spain and Portugal, lay under Muslim rule, forming a polity known as Al-Andalus. Christian elites lost control of their former heartlands, and the old Visigothic kingdom collapsed. A few small Christian enclaves survived in the mountainous north, notably in Asturias, but these were marginal and repeatedly threatened. The immediate effect of the conquest was the replacement of the previous ruling class with a new one that integrated the peninsula into a broader Islamic world stretching from the Atlantic to Central Asia, accompanied with new legal frameworks, religious institutions, and cultural influences. Over the next several centuries, the Christian polities of the north slowly expanded in a process later labeled the Reconquista, or Reconquest, a retrospective term for the cumulative advance rather than a single coordinated campaign. Kingdoms such as Leon, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre grew by exploiting internal conflicts within Al-Andalus and allying with one another when convenient. By the late 15th century, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile brought two of the largest Christian realms under.
In the longer term, even though Poland would again face invasion and occupation in the 20th century, the precedent of reconstitution after total partition reinforced a pattern in which political extinction did not necessarily mean the end of national aspirations. Number 8 turns to Ethiopia, a highland kingdom in the Horn of Africa that nearly collapsed under a devastating 16th century war, yet managed to preserve and rebuild its Christian monarchy. For many centuries, Ethiopia had been ruled by a dynasty that traced its origins to ancient Aksum, an early kingdom and trading power. In the early 1500s, the Adal Sultanate, a Muslim-ruled state based in the lowlands to the east, rallied under Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, often called Ahmad Gran, meaning the left-handed. Backed by firearms and military advisors supplied through connections with the wider Ottoman world, Ahmad launched a series of campaigns into the Ethiopian highlands. Between 1529 and the early 1540s, his forces won repeated victories, sacked churches and monasteries that had long served as centers of learning and religious life, and pushed the Ethiopian court from one refuge to another. Large areas of the kingdom were devastated, and the continuity of the Solomonic dynasty, which claimed descent from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, appeared to be in genuine danger. In response, the Ethiopian leadership sought outside assistance. The Portuguese, who had been exploring maritime routes around Africa and the Indian Ocean, sent a small but technologically important contingent of musketeers. With this support, the Ethiopian forces were able to regroup, and in 1543, at the Battle of Wainadaga, Ahmad Gran was killed and his army defeated. The immediate effect was the survival of the Ethiopian Christian monarchy and the slowing of Adal's advance. In the longer term, the war left a scarred landscape and weakened institutions, but the dynasty rebuilt, re-establishing churches and administrative networks. Ethiopia's ability to retain an indigenous state structure in the aftermath of such devastation contributed to its later capacity to remain independent in an era when many African polities were colonized, although that later period lay centuries in the future. Number 9 focuses on the Iranian Plateau, where the ancient Achaemenid Empire fell to Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, only for new Persian-led states to reassert regional dominance in the form of the Parthian and Sasanian empires. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, had once stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, ruling a multi-ethnic population through satrapies, or provincial governorships. In a rapid series of campaigns between 334 and 330 BCE, Alexander of Macedon defeated the Achaemenid king Darius III, occupied key centers such as Babylon and Susa, and famously burned parts of Persepolis, one of the ceremonial capitals. The old imperial court was displaced, and the territory was divided among Alexander's generals after his early death, creating Hellenistic kingdoms run by Greek and Macedonian elites such as the Seleucid Empire in much of Western Asia. This conquest was not only a military defeat but also a cultural shock, as new forms of art, language, and administration spread. In the short term, local Iranian elites adapted to the new rulers, sometimes serving as intermediaries. Over time, however, resistance and regional autonomy movements grew. Around the mid-3rd century BCE, the Parthians, originating from a nomadic or semi-nomadic group in northeastern Iran, carved out a kingdom that expanded to control much of the old Achaemenid heartland. The Parthian Empire blended Iranian and Hellenistic elements while becoming a primary rival to Rome in the Near East. In the 3rd century CE, a new dynasty, the Sasanians, supplanted the Parthians and consciously revived many symbols and administrative practices associated with the earlier Persian imperial tradition. They promoted Zoroastrianism, an ancient Iranian religion centered on the worship of Ahura Mazda, as a state faith, and built strong centralized institutions. The long-term consequence of these developments was the re-establishment of Iran as a major power that negotiated, fought, and sometimes stalemated with Rome and later the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. The memory of Achaemenid grandeur and the lived reality of Parthian and Sasanian statehood ensured that Alexander's conquest became a dramatic episode rather than a permanent erasure of Iranian political centrality. Number 10 examines Japan's transformation from fragmented civil war during the Sengoku period to the long internal peace of the Tokugawa shogunate. By the mid-15th century, the authority of the Ashikaga shoguns, military rulers who governed in the name of the emperor, had deteriorated. The Onin War, beginning in 1467, triggered prolonged armed conflict among regional warlords known as daimyo. For more than a century, Japan lacked effective central control as rival domains raised their own armies, built castles, and shifted alliances in an almost continuous struggle for territory and influence. This era, called the Sengoku, or Warring States period, witnessed frequent destruction of towns and countryside, widespread displacement, and the emergence of new military and political actors from relatively humble origins. The significance of this chaos lay in the collapse of older hierarchies and the real possibility that Japan would remain permanently divided among competing regional powers. In the late 16th century, a sequence of unifiers began to change this trajectory. Oda Nobunaga used superior tactics and firearms to defeat many rivals in central Japan. After his death, Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued consolidation, redistributing land and conducting surveys that tied warriors and peasants more firmly to the land. Following Hideyoshi's death, a decisive struggle between factions culminated in the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, where Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged victorious. In 1603, he received the title of shogun from the emperor, formalizing his status as military ruler. The immediate consequence was the establishment of a new regime headquartered in Edo, the city later known as Tokyo. Over the next 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate enforced policies that limited warfare among daimyo, required periodic residence in the capital through a system known as Sankin Kotai, and restricted most foreign contact. This produced an extended period of internal peace known as the Edo period. In the long term, that stability allowed population growth, urbanization, the spread of literacy, and the development of a vibrant commercial and artistic culture. The Japan that had once seemed trapped in unending feudal conflict thus emerged as a relatively cohesive and orderly society, poised by the 19th century to respond swiftly to external pressures with its own modernization efforts. Across these varied cases, the pattern of fall and recovery rests on more than the survival of ruling families or military organizations. Deeply embedded social structures, religious institutions, languages, and memories provided frameworks that endured famine, conquest, and civil war. The restoration of centralized authority in ancient Egypt, Imperial China, Byzantium, France, Iberian Spain, Russia, Poland, Ethiopia, Iran, and Japan did not simply recreate what had been lost, but combined older traditions with new circumstances to form altered, often more durable states. The trajectory from ruin to renewed power in each case underscores how political collapse, while real and devastating, need not be the end of a society's historical presence.